welcome everybody. My name is Niharika and I am your tutor for today's lesson. So today we are going to talk about our wonderful family. Now we all love spending some quality time with our family members, right? But when it comes to talking about them, you might get a little nervous because we don't know the exact relations that you share with them. So in today's lesson, we are going to learn the different people of your family. Now, very often you might have come across this question, how many people are there in your family? Well, I have about 30-40 people in my family. Well, that's not what we are looking at. What we are looking at is who are your immediate family members, right? So what is an immediate family? Your immediate family consists of your father, your mother, and your siblings. That is, if you have a sister or if you have a brother. And of course yourself. You have to include yourself because you are a part of this family, right? So siblings would be your sister. Now if she is born before you were born, she would be your elder sister. And your brother, if he was born after you were born, so he would be your younger brother. So when you have to talk about your siblings, you would say, I have an elder sister who works for a bank, and I have a younger brother who goes to a school. Now this is your immediate family. That is, we also call nuclear family. Now, as a family, you'll live together and that's why you are a nuclear family. Now, you also have extended relatives and who are related to your parents. That's your father's side of relatives would be your paternal family members and your mother's side of relatives would be your maternal family members. So, let's write it down here. Your father's side of family would be your paternal family and your mother's side would be your maternal. Now let's look here. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson are your father's parents. And if they are your father's parents, for you, they are your grandparents. So, they are your paternal grandparents, all right? And your father's brother. Now, he has a brother called Peter, and Peter is married to Maria. Now, Peter and Maria are a couple, and they have a beautiful son called Ben. Now, Ben is your cousin. And Peter, who is your father's brother, would be your paternal uncle, and Maria, who is Peter's wife, would be your aunt. Now we also have Jenny. Now who's Jenny? Jenny is your father's sister, all right? And your father's sister would be your paternal aunt, and she is married to William, and William would be your uncle, right? So this is your father's side of family. Now let's look into your mother's side of family. We have Mr. and Mrs. Smith. So mother comes from the Smith family. Mr. and Mrs. Smith are your mother's parents. So for you, they are your maternal grandparents. But your mother also has a brother called Richard. Richard is married to Kelly. And Richard and Kelly have a beautiful daughter called Mary. Now Mary is your cousin. And Richard, who is your mother's brother, would be your maternal uncle, and Kelly would be your aunt. Now your mother also has a sister whose name is Lisa. Now, Lisa is engaged to Ron. So, they are not married yet, but Lisa is engaged to Ron, so Ron is her fiancé. So, for you, Lisa would be your maternal aunt. So, this is your extended family, and here we learned about your paternal side of relatives and as well as your maternal relatives. Now that we learned about the basics of what is a nuclear family and your paternal side of family and as well as your maternal side of family, let's get into the details of your father's side of family, that how they're related to your parents and to you and to your siblings, of course. Now, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson is your father's father. So for your father, Mr. Johnson is his father. For your mother, Mr. Johnson is father-in-law. All right, and for you, Mr. Johnson is your grandfather. Now, do not forget, your Mr. Johnson is your grandfather from your paternal side. Now, Mrs. Johnson is your father's mother. How she is related to your mother? Well, Mrs. Johnson is her mother-in-law. Whereas for you, she is your grandmother. All right, so now let's look at Peter, Maria, and Ben. Now, Peter is your father's brother. He is also the son of Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Johnson. So, Peter would be your father's brother. For your mother, Peter would be the brother-in-law. And for you, Peter would be your paternal uncle. Maria. Now, Peter is married to Maria. Maria would be your father's sister-in-law. As well as your father, of course, married to your mother, for your mother also, Maria would be her sister-in-law. And for you and for your siblings, Maria would be your aunt. And Ben. Now, Ben is Peter and Maria's son. So for your father, he is his nephew. Also, for your mother, he is her nephew. And for you, he is your cousin. And let's look at Jenny. Now, Jenny, we learned that Jenny is your father's sister. So she is your paternal aunt. But for your father, she is his sister. Whereas for your mother, she is her sister-in-law. And for you and for your brother and for your sister, Jenny is your aunt. So again, she is your paternal aunt, whereas she's married to William. And William is, for your father, he is his brother-in-law. For your mother, again, he is her brother-in-law. And for you, he is your uncle. So we learned that how your paternal side of family is related to your parents and to you. So I hope this explains you in detail, and if you want to talk about them, you can always say that my grandfather is Mr. Johnson. His name is Mr. Johnson, and he is a retired person, whereas I have an uncle whose name is Peter, and he works for a company, and Ben is my cousin who goes to school. You can also talk about your aunt. Jenny is my aunt, and she gets me a lot of gifts during Christmas. And again, you can talk about William, who is Jenny's husband, and William is my uncle, and I love him a lot. Alright, now that we learned about your paternal side of family, let's learn about the maternal side of your family, how they're related to you and to your parents. So let's consider Mr. and Mrs. Johnson as your mother's parents, okay? Alright, so if Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Johnson are your mother's parents, then for your mother, Mr. Johnson is her father, Mrs. Johnson is her mother. Whereas for your father, Mr. Johnson is his father-in-law, whereas Mrs. Johnson would be his mother-in-law. For you, the relationships is just the same, that they are your grandparents. Mr. Johnson is your grandfather, Mrs. Johnson is your grandmother. However, they are your maternal side of grandparents. So they are maternal grandparents. Now, Peter, Maria, and Ben. Let's just assume that Peter is your mother's brother. So he is your mother's brother. For your father, he is his brother-in-law. And once again, for you, he's your uncle. But please note that he is your maternal uncle. Whereas Maria, for your mother, she is her sister-in-law, as she's married to Peter here. And for your father, she's going to be his sister-in-law. And for you, she's going to be your aunt. Similarly, Ben would be your mother's nephew, as well as your father's nephew. And for you, he's going to be a little cousin. And Jenny and William, let's assume that Jenny is your mother's sister. So Jenny would be her sister. For your father, she would be his sister-in-law. And for you, she's going to be your aunt. And she's going to be a maternal aunt. Whereas William would be your mother's brother-in-law. For your father, again, he's going to be his brother-in-law. And for you, he's going to be an uncle. So I hope that you understood today about your nuclear family, your extended family, your paternal side of family, and your maternal side of family, and of course you learned about your siblings. I'm sure this lesson would help you to talk about your family confidently with your friends, and of course family is always the best. So I'll see you in your next lesson, and till then you take care. Have a good day.